May I welcome you all to the 2021 TUC LGBT Plus Workers' Conference. My name is Maria Exel and I have the great honour of starting this year's conference. I am chair of the TUC LGBT Plus Workers' Committee and a General Council member where I represent my union, CW. Other members of the committee will be chairing later sessions of the conference. This afternoon, we'll be starting conference with speeches from Frances O'Grady, the General Secretary of the TUC, and Gail Cartmel, TUC President. And then I will make my address as LGBT Plus Committee Chair. Please note, we have a hashtag for the conference, and if you're tweeting, the hashtag to use is hashtag TUCLGBT. That's original, isn't it? Hashtag TUCLGBT. This evening, there are two panel discussions you can attend using the same link as you've had to access this event. From 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock, there's a panel discussion called Black Lives Matter and the LGBT Community. And it'll be followed by another panel discussion called International LGBT Plus Rights from 7 till 8. We hope you will join us for these discussions where we have been lucky enough to have leading voices represented from within the trade union movement and from many of our allies outside it. They're going to be good sessions. Hope you can join. Before we begin the proceedings, I want to call for a 1-minute silence. As many of you know, there's a tradition within the trade union movement. We remember our colleagues who have died over the past year, and we particularly remember our LGBT plus colleagues. But this year of all years, we also remember all those who've died because of the COVID pandemic. I'm just going to start the 1-minute silence now. Thank you, colleagues. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the General Secretary of the TUC, Frances O'Grady. Over to you, Frances.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you to you, to everybody on the committee and everybody tuning in for all the brilliant work that you're doing. As we know, this is our first ever LGBT plus conference online. Personally, I hope it's the last because I really miss everyone. But if I can just say, Maria, you as a telecoms engineer, if anybody has any problems with their broadband, Maria is the person to go to. I also just want to thank all our unions and the TUC team for keeping us going during this year. I may be showing my age here, but I call Quinn the mighty Quinn because he's like this ocean of serenity throughout everything. And of course, I want to give a big warm welcome to Kudsia Batul, who is our new Supremo of Equalities at the TUC and doing a wonderful job. Well, friends, what a year we have had in this country and worldwide. I suspect, like me, you were glued to the screens when I didn't think the world could get any worse when we saw on Capitol Hill those white supremacists insurrection trying to deny the presidential election result in the United States, all defending a man, Donald Trump, who frankly is, a racist, woman-hating homophobe. that was probably one of the grimmest moments. But then, of course, Biden and Harris were inaugurated, and President Biden has issued a presidential memorandum on LGBT plus rights. And I just want to read you one sentence from it, because it says, all human beings should be treated with respect and dignity and should be able to live without fear, no matter who they are or whom they love. And I tell you what, we all know that worldwide, many LGBT plus people literally put their lives on the line fighting for those human rights. But if it can change in the States, it can change anywhere. And I think that should give us all great hope. I also want to pay tribute, almost like before I begin, to everybody who's on this call, who either is or is representing any of our key workers. And by that, I mean, of course, our wonderful NHS and social care workers, but I also mean posties, I also mean shop workers, bank workers, civil servants, people who have kept our deliveries coming. Throughout this whole crisis, there have been millions and millions of people who have stepped up, shown their dedication, who have cared for us. And I think it's time that we cared for them. And so I do want to just plug and encourage people to join our Eve of Budget rally, organised by the TUC, where we will be calling for the Chancellor to give a proper thank you to those key workers, including a proper pay rise. I'm very proud of what the trade union movement has achieved during what has to be one of the toughest years ever for the people that we represent, and not that easy for us as trade unionists either. We know that the pandemic has exposed really deep structural inequalities that were there long before the pandemic ever arrived, but have been magnified by it. But I think when it comes to the LGBT plus community, I think very often those inequalities are still hidden. And part of our job, I think, is to make people sit up and pay attention, and more to the point, take action. If you look at where LGBT plus people are more likely to work, it's very often in the industries that have been hardest hit by this pandemic, often because historically they were industries where it was easier to be out. But whether that's the arts or hospitality or travel, these are the jobs that are on the line. And that's why it was so important that the whole trade union movement came together and fought really hard publicly, but also behind the scenes, to get that furlough scheme in place and get support for the self-employed. And nearly 10 million workers at one stage, in fact, I think it was over 10 million workers together, were dependent on that scheme. We've still got 6 million, and we know how important that is in terms of LGBT livelihoods. We've got to continue to fight, not least in that budget, but I think that's something that we can say, if it wasn't for the trade union movement, then we wouldn't have had that. So I think that's something to be proud of. We also know that LGBT plus people are more likely to be on low pay and insecure contracts, and that's why, everything that we're doing together to fight for gig economy workers' rights is so important, because without those rights, you don't get sick pay, you can't afford to self-isolate, you don't even get the minimum wage, and crucially, you're very often denied that basic right, the right to be accompanied by a trade union. So we are sticking up for workers' rights. And I have to say, what a fantastic victory it was that we got that Uber court case won through the courts. And then thirdly, I would say all the evidence is there that LGBT plus people are more likely to be on the receiving end of bullying and harassment. Hopefully everybody will have seen that TUC survey that showed that so clearly. And working from home even is no protection against that. We've seen what's happened in terms of cyber bullying too. And also the truth is, a lot of people have been, for reasons of money, all sorts of reasons, have been forced back into family homes. And they're not always places of safety, or sanctuary. It can be very tough. We know that when it comes to hate crime, how high those figures are. And we also know when it comes to sexual harassment, how women from the community, and particularly Black women, are much more likely to be on the receiving end. I was particularly, frankly, disgusted to discover that the government cut the funding for schools to run programs to support and to fight against homophobic bullying in schools. I was particularly disgusted by that. That was slipped through, if you like, at the end of last year. So, it should be no surprise, really, that we are facing a mental health crisis in the country, but that we know that particular communities are going to find that tougher, even tougher than others. I think there's a real risk that this pandemic becomes an excuse for pushing back against the progress that we have made together on equality. That you can see that backlash already kicking in. Like everybody else, I was glued to the telly to watch the Channel 4, I think it was absolutely brilliant drama series, It's a Sin, which took you, I know Maria, you mentioned this recently, it took you right back to the 1980s, to the point where I was quibbling about which music they were using on occasion, because I thought they didn't quite have it right. But it took you right back to that kind of time when people were scared, when they felt very isolated, when public health and bigotry were being conflated together to put people in fear and treat them, frankly, abominably. And it's a reminder, really, of just how that prejudice can be unleashed. But it is also a reminder about how the community fought back. And sometimes I think we have to, remember some of this bread and butter, that sometimes it is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And sometimes we need to get back to doing some of that basic organising to win. And I know that takes courage, but I think we have to keep doing that. And, we remember, for example, how the civil service unions, 8 unions, came together under the title Civil and Public Servants Gay Group to win the first ever best workplace practice in respect of HIV and AIDS. That was ordinary people like us coming together, seeing the wrong and putting it right, and making real progress through our collective action. We saw that on Section 28. We've seen it on a whole range of campaigns ever since. And I think it is an inspiration to keep going. And I think there is no better place to start than the government's failure to reform the Gender Recognition Act. We know what TUC policy is. We know a just cause when we see one. And we have to keep using every opportunity we've got to keep pushing on that. We're all trying to do our bit. TUC education and organising for the idea, the truth that trans rights are human rights, are union rights. And I am really, really proud of the little video, I hope people have seen it, that we produced. It's only short, but I think it's really personal and powerful. Encouraging every trans person to join a union, because you know, it is true that there is real strength in unity. If we've ever learned any lessons in the trade union movement, it's that, you know, divided we are weak, united we are strong, and we can win. Well, Maria, one thing I've learned from the online speeches I've been doing this year is that the shorter I am, the more popular I become. But I hope people will accept that my words are no less sincere for that, for their brevity. I think this conference is the pride of the trade union movement. I want to thank everybody for everything you're doing, and I want to wish you a really great conference. Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Frances, for that speech. Conference, we now have the pleasure of hearing from Gail Cartmel, who's TUC president this year. Gail, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. And for those that you don't, for those of you who probably won't know this, but our TUC General Secretary, Frances, on a number of our meetings has the label, the organiser. Is going to sum up the past year in a few minutes. For me personally, it's impossible, so I'm not going to try. What I do know is that this pandemic has brought out the best in so very many of us. The services that Frances referred to as individual trade unionists and as collective trade unionists, never before have we felt, I don't think, the importance in real life of trade union organisation, trade union membership, and what a trade union can deliver. Goodness knows where we'd be were it not for you and for us all collectively. But unfortunately, as the LGBT plus community know all too well, the pandemic has exacerbated deep-seated discrimination, both at work and in wider society. And it's brought to light the pre-existing issue of mental health, felt more profoundly among the LGBT plus community than others. And I'm so proud that in my own union, the colleague who is leading our work in guidance to representatives is from the LGBT plus community, working for a bank on the coalface, giving advice on workplace issues, because that's where we can make a big difference. And it's also the case, and Frances mentioned this, and I can't imagine what this must be like, to be living an independent life as a young person, and then because of the economic impact to the LGBT plus younger community, suddenly finding yourself back in your home, stripped of that independence, and also possibly in a hostile environment. And that to me just really is a terrible setback for our younger LGBT plus members. And that's a really important reason why we've got to, I was going to say kick up the arse the Chancellor, but that would have been awfully rude, so I won't say that. That's why we must stiffen the resolve of the Chancellor and his policy. We also know there's been an escalation of hate crime and hate speech. And that again is a very toxic environment. press. What's really important is not only that you're still here and this conference exists, but you're still here in greater numbers, and this conference has taken on more significance. Your debates and your decisions and how you're going to challenge all of the issues that the TUC survey and the trade union affiliate surveys have shown is such important work. And I just want to say all power to you. Our strength is in our collective. And I agree with Francis. Together we've got a huge amount to celebrate, not least the pride we all hold in our trade union solidarity. So thank you so much, Maria, and I hope you have a great conference.
Thank you very much, Gail, for your contribution. That's great. It's now time for me to give my chair's address on behalf of the LGBT plus committee. It's a warm welcome to every one of you to this, which is the virtual conference of LGBT plus workers in the trade union movement. We may all be locked down, but we can still get together to discuss important issues for our members. Today, we'll be listening to experiences of COVID and the effects it has had on our working and home lives and our mental health. Tomorrow, we'll be hearing the latest from trans and non-binary trade union campaigners and their allies. And don't miss the panel sessions on international rights and on the intersections between Black Lives Matter and LGBT equality that are happening this evening. And check out the myriad of fringe events organised by different unions over these 2 days. This programme has been put together by the TUC LGBT committee to ensure we continue the fight for LGBT rights and liberation in these challenging pandemic times. Challenging times made worse by this Tory government, which plays fast and loose with people's lives. They hollowed out our public sector and local community services with their austerity policies and their drastic programme of cuts to local services that have taken place over the last 11 years. They are in hock to irrational libertarians who prize their narrow economic orthodoxy over people's health and safety and the country's best interests. Even before unemployment rockets, as it is predicted to do in the next period, employers have wasted no time attacking workers and our organisations, the unions. They attack the rights of the very key workers who have kept us going in our homes and in our neighbourhoods over the past year. And let's hear it for those who are taking industrial action to fight back. The British gas workers from the GMB, the Go Bus workers from Unite, and the Open Reach repayment engineers from the CW. They are all fighting for justice in the workplace, for dignity and respect in the face of intolerant and dismissive employers. We have to be prepared to fight back if we are to get out of this pandemic and rebuild. Let's not forget the sacrifices of the health, social care, education and local government workers, many of whom have risked their own lives serving others, caring for the sick and vulnerable, feeding and visiting people to check they're okay. The times are challenging for everyone. But as LGBT trade unionists and LGBT people out in the communities and in our workplaces, we have to endure something more. Backlash with a capital B. This is not surprising. Tory governments always divide and rule. Tory economic dogma means a smaller state and a meaner and nastier society. It's the blame game. Blame the poor for their own poverty, workers in the gig economy for their insecurity, and blame those who are the subjects of hate speech and hate crime for being its victims. The backlash is designed to be divisive, to pit worker against worker, to distract from Tory cronyism with billions of pounds of public money wasted. And it allows those with power to continue to rule. But our trade union values are the opposite of that divisive agenda. We are inclusive. We're about bringing people together. We're about solidarity, supporting each other and changing things for the better. And we will not fall for Tory divide and rule. We have seen our trans and non-binary siblings bear the brunt of the nastiness and prejudice that is out there. There's been a concerted effort by conservative politicians and the media to paint legitimate demands for equality as if they're somehow going to lead to the end of civilization. Who knew that gender stereotypes were so fragile that a few trans people and their allies would lead to the end of the world as we know it? Conference, there is no contradiction between trans rights and feminism. We are all working for the same aim, dismantling the straitjackets of rigid gender stereotypes so we can all live freer and fuller lives. Sadly, we have seen some in our communities who wish to separate the T from the LGB, and some in our movement who use the language of free speech to justify their prejudices against trans and non-binary people. It's a very peculiar concept of freedom that gives you the right to be a bigot. This is not freedom as I understand it. It's not the liberation that we can all gain from a more equal society. And you have to ask yourself, who gains from the promotion of discrimination and the cultivation of fear under the guise of so-called freedom? We can see the hand of those who tried to undermine LGBT rights, now trying to halt the progress of trans rights. The legal cases taken against the Tavistock Clinic and against Stonewall are supported by those with the links to organisations with a reactionary religious ethos. These are the people who took cases on issues of sexuality. There's the ludicrously named Alliance for Defending Freedom, which is far from it. It's clear that these organisations have a misogynist agenda too. This is an orchestrated and organised campaign to curtail our rights, using right-wing money and right-wing media to promote right-wing ideas. The narratives of those who argue for free speech match the political agenda of the current Conservative government, as we've seen in their announcements on academic freedom, so-called academic freedom. We have seen it before. In the 80s, under Conservative governments, we saw LGBT people pathologised, shamed and victim blamed. It is a fair representation of those times. Reactionary ideas of nation, family and religion all played their part in the damaging agenda of the 80s, of Section 28, unequal age of consent, and the repressive policing of our sexuality. I'm pleased to say we have moved on since then. Inclusive families and proud LGBT parents are much more visible and empowered, and there's a growing visibility of LGBT people of faith in all denominations and traditions, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Sikh, and many others. But the post-Brexit political landscape seems to have ignited forces of hate that are not easily stopped. It's not just the transphobia, it's also the racism. Migrants and BME people have been scapegoated. It's also the increasing levels of misogyny that affect cis and straight women, yes, but LGBT women too. LGBT plus disabled people have suffered the neglect and prejudice, as have all disabled people during COVID and as a consequence of the cuts. And those who live in the intersections between these prejudices suffer doubly. As trade unionists, we stand firm. Our movement is built on unity, not division. It's about us learning from each other and moving forward together. On the LGBT plus committee this year, we focused on several different areas of work, and they are detailed in the committee report. Just to highlight a few. Obviously, the impact of COVID is a key area, and we reached out as committee members to members of the LGBT community organisations, including Gallup and Stonewall, to share information on problems of domestic violence, neighbourhood hate crimes, and mental health. And as Francis has said, we're very aware of the fact that some of the sectors most affected economically by the pandemic are ones where out LGBT plus people have been happy to work and are disproportionately represented. While the shocking health and economic inequalities experienced in BME communities and amongst those with disabilities is an area of huge concern, so are the effects of the pandemic on women. But the suffering of LGBT plus people often remains hidden, but it is real. There is an ongoing lack of community infrastructure for us, compounded by lockdowns and isolation from support networks. It has a real effect. Following the success of our motion to Congress supporting comprehensive trans and non-binary rights at the virtual TUC Congress in 2020, and a well-attended fringe meeting on building trans allyship in the union movement at the same Congress, we've done more work on non-binary and trans awareness. There's a non-binary online training module for reps that's now freely available that we developed, and we had a lot of media and promotion of resources during Trans Awareness Week, which Francis made reference to and was supported by the whole of the trade union movement. Fighting racism and the intersection of this with LGBT liberation has also been a focus of the committee's work. International issues remain high on our agenda as well. It's the case, dictators and populists around the world use homophobia, biphobia and transphobia to stir up fear and violence for their own ends. Homophobia, biphobia and transphobia are gateway drugs to the far right. From the LGBT-free zones in Poland, the persecutions in Russia and Hungary of LGBT people, and the use of prejudice against us in Brazil and the US, just to name a few. And today, we send our solidarity to the LGBT rights in Ghana, opening the first LGBT community centre, giving safe space to people, and they're being attacked by mainstream politicians and people from the Patriot Party, unfortunately from some reactionary faith organisations, and also from anti-gay groups. We send them our solidarity and will support them in their efforts to create community support in Ghana. We on the committee have been grateful for the engagement of the TUC International Department, including Mariella Cohone, and from those involved in the TUC project on the far right, including Sue Coe. Another issue the committee has done work on this year is the issue of LGBT equality and sex work. It's been on our agenda and it's the subject of a fringe meeting organised by members of the committee on Friday. Some of you will also have attended the fringe meetings last night, including a very good one from the GMB, I believe, but also a very special one on intersex issues, which was held last night, organised by members of the LGBT committee. Another important issue that we want to take forward in the coming year. And last but not least, despite the lack of real marches and events, we are determined to continue as a committee our coordination between unions to make the prides of the future more political, not just marches, not just events, but political. Conference, it just remains for me to do thank yous to those who've helped us in our work in the past year. To the hardworking members of the TUC Equality team, and a particularly loud shout out to Quinn Roach, our LGBT Equality Officer. Big thanks, Quinn. Also want to thank the previous heads of the TUC Equality and Strategy Department, long-standing members of the TUC, Alice Hood and Nick Smith, who serviced this committee for several years. Thank you for all your work. And a big welcome to Kudzia, who's just started this year and hit the ground running. To the members of the TUC LGBT Plus Committee, who've contributed with great commitment and creativity through this difficult time, I say a personal big thanks. It's amazing what we can do all virtually together. You are all stars.